This past Saturday, we saw an extremely high-level MMA fight take place, but it was not in the UFC. It was between Usman Nurmagomedov and Paul Hughes for the Bellator lightweight title. So this matchup kind of inspired me to talk about the top 10 fighters that are currently outside of the UFC. There's a lot of talent in some of these other promotions. The promotion may not be as popular, but it does not mean that they don't have elite fighters. And some of these people you may not be aware of. So in today's video, we are focusing on that top 10, and we're just going to start it off with the two guys that I mentioned, the two that kind of inspired this video, Usman Nurmagomedov and Paul Hughes. So these two had an extremely close fight. Usman Nurmagomedov won on the scorecards 48-46 on two of them, and then the third one was a 47-47 draw. I really think you could make a case anywhere from 48-46 Usman to 48-46 Paul Hughes. I really do think it could have gone either way with the point deduction. Personally, I scored at 47-47. I thought Paul Hughes won 2 rounds to Usman's 3. You add in the point deduction that Usman received, that would be a tie. But it's not a robbery one way or the other. Very close fight. Starting off with Usman here, he's definitely more of a striker than a grappler. I think people hear the Nurmagomedov name, they're instantly assuming he is a pure wrestler. That's really not his game. He has great kicks, definitely has very solid grappling, and is a submission threat, but it's not really something that he's urgently looking to use like a guy like Khabib may use. He's kind of most similar to Umar, I guess, where he's not overly reliant on the grappling, would kind of prefer to stand and strike. I do think he maybe showed some holes, some weaknesses in the Paul Hughes matchup. The body work seemed to be bothering him. The cardio seemed to be failing him up until the point where he got a big break because of the clash of heads. So it'll be interesting to see another 5-round matchup where someone's pushing the pace on him and he doesn't get that break, but still someone who I think is very legit at this point. And then for Paul Hughes, I mean, he hadn't faced the best competition leading into his run in PFL, but his last 2 fights, he beat AJ McKee in his second PFL matchup, and then he nearly beat Usman. So his last 2 fights, very high-level opponents. He has shown, very good form. He's a powerful striker, great body work like we saw in that Usman matchup. Pretty impressive takedown defense, which was definitely tested. Faded a little bit towards the end in terms of that takedown defense, but still very impressive against someone from that Khabib team. And then we also saw that he has the 5-round cardio. He can push the pace. Definitely seemed like he was the fresher guy at the end of that matchup. I think for both of these dudes, I think right now they are top 10 UFC lightweights if they were in the UFC. And that's pretty impressive considering the fact that lightweight is maybe the best weight class in the UFC. And when you look at these guys' ages, Usman is 26 years old, Paul Hughes is 27. Arman Tsarukyan is the only top 10 fighter at lightweight who is under 33 years old. So it's an older weight class. You have these guys that might be top 10 right now, and they might not even be close to their primes yet, right? When they're hitting 29, 30, 31, 32, they may be peaking, and they could definitely end up making their way to the UFC and potentially competing for a title at some point in their careers. So I think both these guys, definitely some of the top fighters outside of the UFC. This next one, I'll just quickly mention, obviously Francis Ngannou. He left the UFC as the champion. He still might be the best heavyweight in the world. I think a fight between him and John Jones is must-see TV. Same thing for Tom Aspinall. We probably won't see it, but Francis Ngannou obviously has to be mentioned here. Then probably one of my favorite fighters on this list, Dakota Ditcheva. In my opinion, she is the best women's flyweight in the world. This might seem crazy because, right, Valentina has had this amazing career. She's coming off a dominant win over Alexa Grasso, but I would pick Dakota Ditcheva to beat her if they were to match up. I think she is easily the best women's striker right now. She is 14-0, 12 knockouts and 14 wins. You are not seeing that type of finishing upside with most women's fighters. 1 submission win, only gone to decision 1 time, and she's coming off her most recent win, which was a huge step up in competition against Taila Santos. So heading into that PFL championship matchup, she had the pretty record, she had the finishes, she had the highlight reel, but she really hadn't faced that upper echelon of competition in the women's flyweight weight class. And we got to see that in her fight against Taila Santos, someone who arguably beat Valentina Shevchenko, maybe should have taken the belt off of her. Like, Taila Santos is legit, and she just carved her up. This fight was not competitive. She showed off the takedown defense. Her striking is amazing. She's powerful in her hands. She pushes a pace, uses kicks, knees, elbows, mixes it up, goes to the body. I mean, she just, crippled Tyler Santos with her body work in that fight. That's how she found the finish. Honestly, just an awful person to have to stand and strike with. And so if her takedown defense can hold up, which it did against Tyler Santos, I have a tough time seeing anyone in that weight class actually beat her. Like I said, I think she's the best striker. The takedown defense has held up. Dakota Ditcheva, definitely someone who, is going to be a top women's fighter for a very long time. Then we're kind of sticking around in the lighter weight classes here, but we're going to go back to the men where we have Patchy Mix. And I think you can make a real argument that Patchy Mix would be the toughest test for Merab. I'm not saying he's the best or even the second best bantamweight, but stylistically, I just think he's a super interesting test. He's the current Bellator bantamweight champion, 20-1, 13 submission wins, 2 knockouts. And I think what's interesting about Patchy Mix compared to some of these other guys outside the UFC is that the Bellator bantamweight weight class is very, very strong. A lot of these other weight classes are very thin. There's not a ton of top competition. The guys aren't super proven. Like, you can't compare them to someone in the UFC because they just haven't faced the same level. Patchy Mix actually has some real high quality wins outside the UFC. 2 wins over Magomed Magomedov. He has a win over Petr Yan before Yan was in the UFC. He has a win over Kyoji Horiguchi. We know he had success in the UFC. Rafion Stotts, Sergio Pettis. Pettis also had success in the UFC. So those are legit wins. Obviously, he's not facing top 5 in the UFC, but still, very solid performances. And then he's also finishing those guys. So finishes over Pettis, Stotts in the first Magomedov fight. Patchy Mix is legit. I think he'd be a top 5 bantamweight. And stylistically, I would love to see that Merab matchup just because he is such a submission threat. He is so slick. Is Merab going to want to go and repeatedly shoot on him when Patchy Mix could potentially lock something up? Super, large frame, long arms for the weight class. So Patchy Mix definitely belongs in this video. Then we're going to be going over to the PFL with Shamil Musayev. He is the current PFL welterweight champion. He honestly kind of came out of nowhere and just had an insane 2024 season. Made his debut in the PFL. He started it off with a ground and pound KO against Logan Storley. Storley was a former Bellator interim champion, very respectable fighter. Then he had back-to-back wins over 12-0 Murad Ramazanov, who, obviously undefeated, had some hype heading into the tournament, beat him back-to-back. And then to win the $1 million, he knocked out 17-0 Magomed Umalatov. So just great performances, finished 3 of those 4 fights against legit competition. I think he's a top 10 welterweight. You can make an argument he's top 5. I think welterweight's very up in the air right now. I think if you threw him into the UFC, he would be a very, very interesting addition. Just a super dangerous fighter. Then we're going to be looking at Bellator here, where we have Vadim Nemkov, the former light heavyweight champion who has recently moved up to heavyweight. He is 19-2 as a pro. His only 2 losses, one was a split decision, and the second one was a loss to Yuri Prochazka all the way back in 2015. So he's been undefeated for a while now. 10 knockouts, 5 submissions. He's well-rounded. Wins over Corey Anderson, Phil Davis twice, Ryan Bader, Yoel Romero. Obviously, some of those dudes kind of out of their prime, but in terms of competition outside the UFC, he's faced a decent amount of decent opponents. He is a powerful striker, has 5-round cardio, which is not a guarantee up at light heavyweight. Heavyweight, I'd say he's a plus grappler, especially compared to the other guys in those weight classes. I do think he's better at 205. I think he's probably a little bit undersized for some of the elite heavyweights. But I think at 205 or probably heavyweight, he's top 5. I think at 205, he's like easily top 5, might be the best, honestly, light heavyweight in the world. I think he's not the best matchup for Pereira, but worst case, I think he's top 3, top 5. And then he's probably around the number 5 area at heavyweight. Like you can probably tell, I'm not quite as high on him at heavyweight, but if he were to go back down to light heavyweight, I think he's a real threat for Alex Pereira or whoever would be holding that belt. Now we're going to be talking about one of the 2 KSW fighters I have on here. We're going to start off with Salahdine Parnasse. He is only 27 years old, and he is the KSW 2-division world champ. So featherweight and lightweight, 145, 155. He holds both of those belts. He is 20-2 as a pro. One of those losses was him actually trying to go up and be a 3-weight champion. So he tried to go up and get the 170 belt. Didn't work out, but I mean, still, very impressive record. He's well-rounded, 5 KOs, 7 submissions. We know he has the 5-round cardio. He has won 2 5-round fights, and then also has 3 finishes in the championship rounds, 3 round 4 finishes. Someone where I believe he was a free agent somewhat recently. UFC didn't come with a big enough offer. I actually think him and Paul Hughes were free agents at a similar time, and the UFC, just for whatever reason, weren't really willing to pay up. So we saw Paul Hughes go to the PFL. Parnasse stayed in KSW. Hopefully we do get to see him in the UFC at some point, though. Clearly talented and has a lot of, tread left on the tires at only 27 years old. We're going to be going back to Bellator with Johnny Eblen, who is their current middleweight champion. I think someone who had a lot of hype maybe like a year or two ago, kind of cooled off a little bit based on his last couple of performances, but he's still 16-0. Has 4 title wins, just completely shut out Gegard Mousasi, which is probably where his hype was, at the peak. Wins over Anatoly Tokov. He's beaten Fabian Edwards twice. That's Leon Edwards' brother. I think where people maybe started to fade off of him was his matchup against Impa Kasanganay, where Kasanganay was kind of bouncing between 170, 185, even though he was fighting in the PFL at 205. That was a very, very tough fight. And you look at Impa's run in the UFC, didn't go great. So the fact that Johnny Eblen won a close decision, not ideal, but I still think he's a top 10 middleweight, competitive with guys like Marvin Vettori, Jared Cannonier, Brendan Allen, Roman Dolidze. I think he's kind of in that group. And I do believe he's talked about wanting to go to the UFC, wanting to test himself. I believe he's a training partner of Sean Strickland, or they have trained together before. So the fact that he's trained with the guy who was the champion and feels confident to go over, I feel like that's a decent sign when it comes to his potential future in the UFC. And then the last guy here, number 10, we have Phil DeFries. And he actually has had a run in the UFC. He's only 2-3, but that was back in 2011. And then his last fight was in 2013. So 5 UFC fights, pretty much 12 years ago at this point, which is crazy that he had that run early in his career and then is still finding success. But he has just had a career resurgence in KSW, 12-0, 12 title wins in that promotion. 9 of those are finishes. He really just has a suffocating grappling style at heavyweight, which not a ton of guys can deal with. I think if I were to have a comp, he'd be a better, more annoying, Sergey Spivak, a Marcin Tybura, guys like this, where they're not super explosive, athletic. They're not going to go out and KO you in one punch, but they can wear you down. They're not fun matchups for a lot of these heavyweights. Also a Tom Aspinall training partner. So I don't think he would be a champ. I think obviously he's going to struggle with a guy like Aspinall. I think Cyril Gane, honestly, is probably it's a bad matchup for Gane if they were to fight. I think a guy like Curtis Blades probably has his number. We'll see about Pavlovich's takedown defense. Volkov could probably keep the range. John Jones obviously probably doesn't go well. But I think aside from the few elite guys in the heavyweight weight class, he would compete. And I do think he'd be in the number 5 area, somewhere in there. Probably won't come over. Has a good thing going in KSW. I don't see why he'd come over to the UFC, just racking up the wins over there. But someone who I do think is a top fighter outside of the UFC right now. So that's going to wrap it up for my top 10. Clearly a ton of talent out there. Obviously, I think we'd like to see all these people, test themselves in the UFC, but I also think it's good to have some variety, have some stars in these other promotions. I think the more promotions that are, doing well, the better it is for MMA and MMA fighters as a whole. So let me know your thoughts on these fighters. If you have anyone that was left off the list, let me hear it. But thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.